Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Byron David Smith? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Byron David Smith was born on June 11, 1948, and lived in Little Falls, Minnesota. This is about an hour and 45 minutes northwest of Minneapolis. Byron worked as an engineer for the State Department for many years. He traveled all around the world and installed security systems. He never married and never had children. When Byron retired from the State Department, he moved back to his hometown of Little Falls. Unfortunately, not everything was peaceful in that town. In 2012, two local teenagers caused some difficulties for the residents of Little Falls. 17-year-old Nicholas Brady, who went by the name Nick, and his 18-year-old cousin, Haley Kiefer, had developed difficulty regulating their intake of substances. In order to fund their continued use, they had resorted to criminal behavior, including burglary. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On October 27, 2012, Byron's house was burglarized. The perpetrator had taken a rifle, a shotgun, and other valuable items out of his house. Due to the fear of the burglars returning, 64-year-old Byron developed sleeping problems, and his mood became increasingly erratic. He started carrying a gun in his house and installed 4 security cameras on the exterior. On November 22, 2012, Thanksgiving Day, Byron was talking to his neighbor, Bill Anderson, when he saw a vehicle drive by and became concerned about his house. Byron returned to his house, climbed in his pickup truck that was in his driveway, drove a few blocks away, and parked it outside another home. He then walked back to his house, arriving at 11:45 a.m. Instead of walking to the main entryway, he walked through his backyard to gain access. Byron made his way to his basement and activated an audio recording device. He sat in a chair which was facing the side of the stairwell into the basement. Byron was prepared to sit there for a while. He had a water bottle, snacks, and a novel. Right near the chair, Byron had a Ruger Mini 14 rifle. On his belt, he was carrying a 9-shot .22 caliber revolver. Not far from where he was seated, there was a monitor displaying images from the security cameras. At 12:33 p.m., Nick Brady approached Byron's house, but he wasn't there to give thanks. Instead, he broke a window in Byron's bedroom on the main floor and made entry. After a few minutes, he started walking down the stairs into the basement. Byron shot Nick twice with the Ruger Mini 14 as soon as Nick's hips became visible. Nick tumbled down the basement steps and onto the floor. He was groaning. Byron closed the distance and shot him in the head, after which Byron said, "You're dead." He accurately described the situation. Byron put Nick on a tarp, dragged his body to a workroom in the basement, and reloaded his rifle. 8 minutes after the shooting, Haley Kiefer made entry into Byron's house. She quietly called out the name Nick as she walked through the house. When she did not hear a response, she started walking down the basement steps. Just as was the case with Nick, as soon as Byron saw Haley's hips, he shot her. Haley tumbled down the stairs. Byron attempted to shoot her again with the Ruger Mini 14, but it malfunctioned. Byron produced the .22 caliber revolver and shot Haley 3 more times. He said, "You're dying," before shooting her again. Byron referred to her using an expletive that rhymes with the word witch and dragged her body over to the tarp. He placed her on top of Nick's body. Haley was still alive. Byron shot her for a 6th time, killing her. At this point, Byron had 2 dead bodies in his basement, yet he did not notify the authorities. Instead, he talked to himself over the course of several hours. The next day, November 23, Byron spoke to his neighbor Bill Anderson and asked him to find him a lawyer. Later, Byron asked Bill to call the police and informed him that he had solved the break-ins in the neighborhood. When the police arrived at Byron's house, he walked outside with his hands up and said he needed to tell them something. He explained how his house had been burglarized several times. The most recent burglary was the day before. Byron directed the officers to the bodies in the basement and explained to them how he shot and killed the intruders. Byron was placed under arrest. He was initially charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder, but then in April of 2013, a grand jury indicted him on 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. On April 29, 2014, Byron David Smith was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. He was given 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole to be served concurrently. Before weighing the evidence in this case, I'll provide a few thoughts on areas that stood out to me. Item number 1. Byron said that his house had been burglarized at least 6 times in the months leading up to the shooting. He only reported the October 27 burglary. The police were only able to verify 2 burglaries other than the Thanksgiving Day burglary. One was the October 27 burglary, when Byron's firearms were stolen. It is reasonable to believe that Byron was frightened and frustrated by the repeated criminal activity of the burglars. Even if he exaggerated the number of burglaries that occurred, and I don't know if he did or didn't, Byron had a legitimate reason to be concerned for his safety. Item number 2. Nick and Haley were considered troublemakers, but Nick seemed to be the one who really found himself causing problems. The police determined that he was responsible for the October 27 burglary of Byron's house, and there was evidence he was involved in another unrelated burglary. He was also being investigated for stealing drugs. Nick was a brazen and dangerous offender who was terrorizing the community. Even if he had not stolen firearms from Byron, it was reasonable to believe that Nick could have been armed and willing to hurt or kill people. Burglary is a dangerous game, especially of a private residence. Item number 3. Byron moved his pickup truck and walked back to his house through the backyard. This makes it seem as though he was trying to make his house look unoccupied. It would be a more enticing target for the teenage burglars. Byron told the police that he simply wanted to clean out his garage and protect his vehicle from being vandalized. This is impossible to believe. Furthermore, Byron went down into his basement and sat on a chair facing the basement steps. He had 2 firearms with him. It's like he was in a deer stand waiting for a target to cross his path. Byron could have called the police when Nick broke in, after shooting Nick, or immediately after shooting Haley, but he didn't call the police at any of those times. Instead, he waited until the next day. Item number 4. Prior to Nick breaking into Byron's house, Byron activated the audio recorder. He could be heard making a few unusual statements. He said, quote, "in your left eye," unquote. This is significant because later he would shoot Haley in her left eye. Byron also said, quote, "I realize I don't have an appointment, but I would like to see one of the lawyers here," unquote. This makes it seem as though he knew he would need a defense attorney. The statements support the idea that Byron had planned on killing the burglars and knew that his actions could be considered murder. Item number 5. Byron had an explanation for why he didn't immediately notify the police. He said that he did not want to ruin Thanksgiving Day for the officers. He also said that he was worried that more intruders would be coming into his house. Considering that Haley entered the house after Nick did, one can understand why Byron may have been worried about more burglars. However, if he really believed this, he should have called the police. The fear of more intruders is not a reason to refrain from calling for help. Item number 6. The state of Minnesota uses the reasonable person doctrine as far as self-defense. A person may defend themselves from an aggressor by using only the amount of force necessary to prevent the attack or protect themselves from harm. The amount of force must be proportionate to the threat posed by the offender. Considering that Nick and Haley were burglarizing Byron's house when they were shot, Byron was justified in using lethal force. The problem for Byron was not his initial use of force, rather his use of force after the burglars were already disabled. Item number 7. Byron stayed in his house after the killings and made several statements over the course of a few hours. They were captured on his audio recorder. Here are a few of his statements. Quote, "Of course, I'm safe now," unquote. Quote, "Cute. I'm sure she thought she was a real pro," unquote. Quote, "I am not a bleeding heart liberal. I felt like I was cleaning up a mess," unquote. Quote, "In some tiny little respect, I was doing my civic duty. If the law enforcement system couldn't handle it, I had to do it," unquote. Quote, "They weren't human. I don't see them as human. I see them as vermin, social mistakes, social problems," unquote. He continued by saying, quote, "This blank was going to go through her life, destroying things for other people, thieving, robbing, drug use," unquote. Byron said, quote, "It's all fun, cool, exciting, highly profitable, until somebody kills you," unquote. When talking about shooting the teenagers on the stairs, Byron said, quote, "It's a sucker shot. People going down strange stairs naturally watch the steps," unquote. Byron suggested that he needed to kill the burglars when he said, quote, "If I gather enough evidence, they might be prosecuted. If they're prosecuted, it might go to court. If it goes to court, they might be found guilty. If they're found guilty, they might spend 6 months, 2 years in jail, and then they're out. And they need money worse than ever, and they're filled with revenge. I cannot live a life like that. I refuse to live with that level of fear in my life," unquote. Some of these statements make it seem as though Byron wanted to take the law into his own hands. He felt as though he needed to kill the burglars or else they would escape justice and come back and harm him. One could argue that some of the statements hurt Byron's case, but others make him appear like he was under a lot of stress. Maybe he was legitimately afraid of being harmed. With all these items in mind, let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that Byron was guilty of murder, starting with the inculpatory factors. Byron took actions to attract the burglars. His statements were consistent with an intent to kill the burglars from the beginning. Byron claimed that Haley laughed at him, which motivated him to shoot her even after she was disabled. The recorder did not capture Haley laughing. Byron told the police that when Nick came down the stairs, he wanted him to be dead. After shooting Haley 5 times, he noticed that she was gasping for breath and shot her again. Byron said, quote, "I fired more shots than I needed to," unquote. He also said, quote, "I thought she was dead and it turned out she wasn't. So I did a good, clean finishing shot. And she gave out the death twitch. First time I've ever seen it in a human, but it works the same in beaver and deer and whatever," unquote. Moving to the exculpatory factors, the state conceded that Nick and Haley were killed while committing a felony. They were dangerous offenders, and Byron was within his rights to use lethal force against them. The only issue in this case was his continued use of force after the burglars were disabled. Byron may have used more force than necessary because of his emotions, like he was acting out of fear and panic. Nick had caused this emotional response to be stronger by targeting Byron's house for a second time. Byron had exhibited quite a bit of behavior consistent with being genuinely frightened, like installing security cameras and carrying a gun around his house. When considering all the evidence in this case, do I think that Byron David Smith was guilty of murder? This case is challenging because Byron did have the right to defend himself against the intruders, but he should not have continued to shoot them after they were disabled. Byron wasn't interested in having them arrested. Rather, he wanted a more permanent solution. In my opinion, he was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. I think one could make a decent argument that he was not guilty of murdering Nick because he could have panicked when he fired the last shot. But there's not much question in my mind that he was guilty of murdering Haley. Considering that life in prison is the sentence for either murder, the distinction is academic. Now moving to my final thoughts. Byron was convicted because he gave the jury a glimpse into his thought processes. The audio recording is what really hurt his case. One member of the jury stated that the recording sealed the deal and indicated that they were dealing with a deranged individual. Byron had so many other options in the situation that would have permitted him to avoid the guilty verdict. For example, he would not have been convicted if he didn't continue to shoot the intruders, if he didn't audio record the murders, and if he didn't confess to pausing between the first and second groups of shots. Byron is in prison for life because he found a way to be guilty. There was no need to finish off these burglars. Shooting them initially was more than satisfactory to stop them. Byron became lost trying to satisfy his own sadism. He wanted to do more than defend himself. He wanted to kill. Byron was interested in revenge. He accomplished his goal, but sacrificed his freedom in the process. Due to his Thanksgiving massacre, Byron has only himself to thank for his prison vacation. Those are my thoughts in the case of Byron David Smith. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching. Some viewers may notice that I've covered the topic of Byron David Smith before. I originally covered this story in November of 2020. So from the time of making this video, that's almost 3 years ago. I had a number of requests to cover it again because the way I analyze these cases has evolved over the years, and a lot of people wanted my new format to be applied to this particular case. It really is an unusual case. You don't see many cases where somebody has the right to shoot others, but not the right to kill others. Also, it seemed like Byron was trying to plan a self-defense episode, which never works out. So it's an interesting case, and I was happy to revisit it. Again, thanks for watching. Talk to you soon.